Okay, I don't know if any of y'all did the extra credit part there about the background to the war. That's just an interesting part, I find anyway. But what we're going to look at now here is America's efforts to remain neutral. And AP makes a big deal about that, right? Alrighty. Okay, so for the key concept here, y'all, America is going to be neutral in this war. Remember, this is kind of a continuation of our policy to try to stay out of European wars, going back to George Washington's farewell address. Look for that continuity. So this marks a big break in it. We stay neutral initially, just like we did during the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and all that stuff. But that neutrality is going to end. You're going to see something very similar happen in World War II, where we try to stay out of it. But it's not a benign or even-handed neutrality, y'all. We definitely favor one side, okay? And that is the Allies, both in World War I and World War II. So after initial neutrality in World War I, okay, the nation entered the conflict, departing from that U.S. foreign policy tradition of non-involvement in European affairs. That is, non-involving ourselves in their wars, in response to Woodrow Wilson's call for the defense of humanitarian and democratic principles. So he's going to call this, y'all, a war to make the world safe for democracy. He's going to say we're not entering it because of alliances or because we're greedy, wanting land or anything. We're entering it for the best of reasons. Now, the next thing y'all are going to see, I don't have you taking any notes on this, but please watch. It's from a great show. I wish I had more time to show y'all more of it, about America in World War I. But anyway, here we go. Okay, so this video is going to get into why America eventually enters the war.
So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality. But neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the US, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race.
The Russians, and of
as
course,
Russia
this is going to be a
leaving
big
the
thing.
war,
When the
and
Russians
the United
leave
States
the war,
get enough troops
we can
in
enter this war by
to
saying,
tilt
oh,
that
we're fighting for
scale in
democracy. You
favor of
really
the
couldn't
Allies.
say that when
They brought in the
Russians
men,
were in there,
the
of
material, and the resources
Totalitarian.
that these
Well, not
allies
totalitarian.
needed desperately.
Aristotic.
The French and the British were
Aristoc-
suffering a sense that the war was
autocratic
stalemated,
society.
that
There we go.
defeat might be coming, and the American commitment
There we
was
go.
a real
Famous,
shot in the
famous
arm
picture.
for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
You
Prior
see
to the
trenches
outbreak
so
of World
common.
War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the
I just
end
kind
of
of
the
want you guys to have a
war,
mental image of it. I'll
we
show you a lot of
positioned
clips.
ourselves
Hopefully they won't block
as
them
one of the
all, but I'll
world
give you guys
powers for
mental
the rest of the
images
century.
What this war looked like. All right, there you go. All right, so that was a good overview. Okay, so the next thing I have here, y'all, and I know I say to read and to highlight the major points. This is Woodrow Wilson's address on neutrality, okay? You guys could see a document like this. This is perhaps maybe a bit longer than AP would have on a test, but I did include quite a bit of it. So we're going to go through and look at that. And remember, you guys are always looking for, obviously, who the intended audience is, who's he saying this to. And be as specific as you can. Remember, you can use personas for that. Also, where is Wilson coming from? In other words, what's his point of view? As well as, of course, the historical context. So the war is going on. This is the context. The war is going on. America has chosen neutrality. But a lot of Americans, as you guys will see, are very sympathetic to the British side and to the French side based on our past history. But you also have some German and Irish Americans who aren't very big fans of the British as well. So this is his address to the people, and so here we go. The effect of the war upon the United States will depend on what American citizens say and do. Every man who really loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality, which is a spirit of impartiality and fairness and friendliness to all concerned. But I'll ask you guys, do you really think that's what we do based on what you find, how we are aiding the Allies this whole time? The spirit of the nation in this critical matter will be determined largely by what individuals and society and those gathered in public meetings do and say, upon what newspapers and what magazines contain, upon what ministers utter in their pulpits and men proclaim as their opinions on the street. So in other words, everybody's going to be judging you at this point, right? Remember, y'all need to be able to describe in your own words. Americans are constantly going to be judged. Are we truly being neutral? The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, right? As you guys know, we're a nation of immigrants, and you're going to see a lot of division between Americans about this war, and chiefly from the nations now at war, right? British, French, German, all of those. It is a natural and inevitable that there should be an utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict. We know some of you, because of where you're from, are going to want to side one others. Some may wish one nation, others another, to succeed in this momentous struggle. It will be easy to excite passion and difficult to allay it. In other words, it'll be easy to get people all riled up, and once that happens, it's going to be hard to stop it. Those responsible for exciting it will assume a heavy responsibility for no less a thing than that the people of the United States, who love of their country and whose loyalty to its government should unite them as Americans all, bound in, trying to find it because I'm blocking out my own reading here, bound basically here in honor and affection, to think first of her and her interest, may be divided in camps of hostile opinion, hot against each other, involved itself in the war, in impulse and opinion, if not in action, okay? So it's just going to be really easy for people to do this, but he's telling people, look, your first duty is as Americans. We should be united as Americans. And secondly, to be thinking of, well, I'm French American, I'm British American, or whatever. So he's reminding people of that. Such divisions amongst us would be fatal to our peace of mind and might seriously stand in the way of the proper performance of our duty as one great nation at peace. In other words, you got this duty, he's seeing it as being the peacemaker, the one people holding itself ready to play the part of impartial mediation and speak the counsels of peace and accommodation, not as a partisan, but as a friend. In other words, if we start siding too much with one side, it's going to be really hard for us to be this neutral mediator that gets between these two groups and says, let's work out a deal, okay? Now, he then says, I venture, therefore, my fellow countrymen, to speak a solemn word of warning to you against that deepest, most subtle, most essential breach of neutrality which may spring out of partisanship. Partisanship is like being on one side or another, particularly one party, out of passionately taking sides. And this is a very, very famous quote. Make sure you highlight this one. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. He's basically talking about, that's a quote from Thomas Paine's American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls, okay? We must be impartial in thought, okay? On the back page here. We must be impartial in thought as well as action, must put a curb upon our sentiments, as well upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another, okay? So he's kind of asking the impossible here, right? Like, it's hard. It's hard to sit back and to watch a war's going on, and if you're from that country, to not feel some kinship. Like, if, currently, if you're like of Ukrainian descent, for example, it'd be hard for you to sit back and to just see what Russia is doing to the Ukraine, okay? And not have an opinion about that. But he is basically asking that of us. Now, so, what's his purpose here? Well, he is trying to keep America neutral in hopes that America can be the sort of problem solver, the peacemaker. Who's his audience? His audience is probably Americans who are from those countries that are at war, right? Those people who are wanting to pick one side over the other. His purpose is to try to keep Americans neutral, keep us out of this war, allow us to be that mediator, okay? And so it's a very, very important speech, especially that line about be neutral in fact as well as thought, that kind of thing. And that's hard to do, all right? Okay, y'all, so we come to one of the biggest reasons why America goes to war. This is important for AP, but especially for STAR. This is specifically called out by STAR. And this is what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. Restricted means, certain rules you got to follow. Unrestricted means no rules to follow, okay? So this policy is going to mean basically sinking any ship, enemy or neutral, that is in this war zone without warning, okay? The submarine could surface and fire shells from from a cannon that it had on board the U-boat, the submarine, or it could send a torpedo. You're just sitting there minding your own business. You're over here around Ireland or England. This is the declared war zone, and your ship could be suddenly sunk. I've read some incredible accounts, y'all, of what it was like for people to be on those ships, men, women, children. You have no idea what's happening to you as your ship is being shot up to pieces, or as the ship is sinking in waters and people are rushing to try to get onto the lifeboats. It's an awful, awful way to go. And so notice this applied to neutrals. In other words, if you're a neutral over here, we're going to assume you're up to no good. And neutral ships, that's going to include, of course, the United States. Now, Germany goes back and forth about this policy. I don't want to get into all the details, but Germany at first tried to rescue people that it sunk or give them a warning to let them get off. But with the radio, or at least with telegraph, wireless telegraph, they could delay and get a British ship to come to their aid. Also, the U-boats didn't have room to carry all these people, hundreds, maybe even thousands on some of these ships. So it came to be where they would just sink them, and many people would die. But as it would shock people, the Germans would back off and say, hey, sorry, we went too far. We're going to go back to warning people. But as more and more ships came to Britain and France, y'all, it became harder for the Germans to sit back and just watch their enemies being aided when they themselves weren't getting much of that trade because of the British blockade, okay? So anyway, y'all, the Germans will announce a pledge. We're not going to, after sinking some ship and killing some civilians, we're not going to do that anymore. Then the Germans would announce, oh, we're back to unrestricted submarine warfare. And then it's like back and forth, okay? Now, one of the biggest incidents, but often misunderstood, is the sinking of the British liner Lusitania. You'll hear a lot of people say it was the Lusitania that got us into World War I. No, but it definitely changed everybody's mind, y'all, about Germany, okay? The Lusitania had been built before Titanic. She was a beautiful, beautiful ship, a lot faster than Titanic, not quite as luxurious, but held, roughly about the same number of people. Now, I know this is going to sound like crackhead talk, but believe it or not, during World War I, y'all, people carried out normal, trips back and forth across the ocean through submarine-infested areas. I know this sounds crazy, but it sounds crazy because you and I know what happens to Lusitania. Not too long ago, an Air Malaysian airline, y'all, was flying from the Netherlands to Malaysia. And it flew over the Ukraine, where there was conflict going on, and the Russians apparently shot it down. Evidence seems to suggest it was the Russians. And everybody was kind of shocked, like, oh my gosh, you shot down a plane with passengers. But at the same time, y'all, there needs to be some common sense. You shouldn't be traveling through a war area with civilians and expect magically nothing to happen. And yet, that's what happens with the Lusitania. Now, this is an ad that was in the newspapers. It lists all the different trips, you know, the Transylvania, the Orduna, the Tuscania, and the Lusitania in big capital letters, okay, leaving here May 29th. This must be a later trip because it was sunk before then. And, of course, you see some of the other trips that were here. This must have been like a return from the return or whatever. But anyway, this was the advertisement, okay? Now, right by the advertisement of the Lusitania was this notice. Notice who put this out, the Imperial German Embassy, okay? So this is the German Embassy in Washington, D.C., putting this ad by the Lusitania ad, reminding people, hey, travelers intending to go on this Atlantic voyage are reminded that there's a war between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that we've declared this zone of war around the British Isles. And if you fly the flag of Great Britain, which the Lusitania does, or any of its allies, you're liable to destruction in those waters. Basically, Germany is warning them, okay? If you do this, you could die. Now, of course, people read this. If they did read this, they already booked their tickets. They weren't about to change. Only a handful of people, y'all, changed their minds and didn't board the Lusitania that day. So in May 1915, a German U-boat, which is a submarine, that stands for Unterseeboot, like an underwater boat, sinks the British passenger ship Lusitania, okay? Now here is a copy of that U-boat. This was U-20. Now I've got some rare historical footage here. You see the captain of the Lusitania, excuse me, of the U-20, firing this torpedo. It takes a little while for it to go. Now it's right off the coast of Ireland. It's a beautiful day. 2:10, people are finishing up a late lunch. Finally, they notice the bubbles of the torpedo coming their way. You notice the smokestacks have been painted black and away from the side of the ship. It's not as obvious. There's Captain Turner. There's not a whole lot you can do. It's going to hit us. Right? And it hits right on the side. Now, there is evidence of secondary explosions. Some people believe that the stores exploded. The Lusitania possibly continued with carrying some munitions. It wasn't great. And we don't know what all exploded, but it blew a big, big hole in the side of the Lusitania. Water began to destroy the Lusitania. The Lusitania began to onto its starboard. Now the captain knew how close he was to the water to Ireland, and he was hoping to maybe warn the ship.
Please, everyone, keep calm.
Continued to move.
If we have been hit, we shall simply put into port. All of you make your way to the lifeboat decks, and I suggest you find yourselves a lifeboat.
Yes, we should use the medicines.
The elevator. If there's ever a fire or a problem, the power might go. You don't do it. Check out this girl. Well, this is my dessert. I'm going to finish it. You see the panic. It's like Titanic. You have like almost 3 hours to Jack and whatever her name
responding, sir. On starboard.
Ships on answering,
sir. Lost pressure.
Like I said, the captain kept going. That's the real problem, though, y'all, because over lifeboats,
Hoist them not in command, sir. Go to the engine room, find out what the problem is, see what can be done.
Also, there's the possibility that the lifeboats
Engines are out of commission.
to the back, and
Sir,
the ship begins
7 degrees to starboard,
sink
sir.
from the front.
At this rate, we won't make it to
Stern of the
port.
ship,
Lower
back of
the
ship
lifeboats
is
to the
lifted,
rail,
so
Anderson, but
the
don't
power
launch until we slow.
you might just drift into. Okay?
Good luck.
Now, 128 Americans get killed on this, okay? And about 1,000 people as well. You know, I always get upset, y'all. I don't know about y'all, but I always get upset on the news where they'll say, 1 million people died. And, you know, or they'll say like, 5 Americans today died. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's awful. And 1 million other people. What, we count like 200,000 people each ourselves? It's kind of weird when that happens. But anyway, 128 Americans died, okay? Including some very wealthy Americans, right? One of the Vanderbilts died. a very successful Broadway producer died, and some others. And this was really shocking for a lot of Americans. All right, the bodies continued to float up for some time. Now, here you see the people in the water splashing. It was, like I said, a warm day.
At 2:28,
like,
just 18
Jack
minutes
and
after
all
she
them.
was
There's
struck,
the
Lusitania disappears
It was in such
beneath the
shallow
waves.
water, y'all, that the tip of the ship actually
For
hit
many,
the bottom.
2:28
while the float was still
is
sticking
the
up.
last minute
And
of their lives.
As a result, she rolled over on the side. But yeah, bodies, y'all, they continue
For others
to
stranded
float
in the
up,
freezing
make
waters
their
of
way
the
in
Atlantic.
current all around
The
Ireland
horror
for
is
some
only
time.
beginning.
Okay. Now,
Word
one of
of the
my friends, Eric Sauter, is a expert on the Lusitania, and Eric has a lot of things that have been recovered from the wreck. He's managed to dive in submersibles to it, and quite chilling what he says about the death of this beautiful ship and all the people in it. There you see a painting, okay, of the Lusitania. You see them trying to load or lower the lifeboats. It was chaos, y'all. Like I said, the lifeboats would hit the water, and then they would flip over. It was just awful, awful. And here you see pictures of the bodies that were recovered, you know, and they had numbers on them. Photographs were taken of the bodies in hopes that families later could identify them. It's awful, y'all. There's just no other way to describe it. Now, the Germans are, you know, first of all, President Wilson is really, really upset about this. You sank a ship with Americans? Well, they shouldn't have been on the ship. It was the British. You sank a ship with Americans? You can't do that. And so he didn't threaten war, but he was very, very upset. And it was obviously that there was a ship. Now, his Secretary of State, the pacifist, William Jennings Bryan, yes, the same guy, a populist who ran for president like 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd power, he resigned in protest. He thought Wilson was being too tough about this. The Germans temporarily stopped the unrestricted submarine warfare after the sinking or after the attack on the Sussex. This is the so-called Sussex Pledge. But in early 1917, the Germans decide, look, we've got to stop all this aid coming to the British. If we can do enough and we can sink enough ships quickly, maybe, and they know this will probably bring America into the war, maybe we can launch an offensive before Americans can get over here in large numbers. So we'll starve the British out like they're trying to starve us out. We know this will get us into war, but it'll take America a year or so to get its act together and get over here. So in 1917, Germany announces that it will be ending the restricted submarine warfare and will be going back to unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship, civilian or military, that is in this war zone. And the next thing that's going to get us into this war is, and of course here you see some stuff from the Lusitania. You see the Lusitania sinking back there. But the next thing that's going to get us into the war is the Zimmermann telegram. So please make sure you know this for STAR as well as AP. So first of all, in 1917, Germany's ambassador Zimmermann sends a telegram to Mexico. Okay, so he's Germany's ambassador, and he sends a coded telegram through Mexico. It actually made its way through Galveston before making its way to Mexico, by the way. Here's a picture of Zimmermann, okay? And this is what the telegram was. It might be kind of hard for y'all to see at home there or on your little phones or whatever you're watching this, but this is just basically a series of numbers. So this was coded, right? You had to be able to break the code or know the code to know what the Germans are saying. And of course, down in Germany, you know, or down in Mexico, the German ambassador down there would have the code. Now, what this Zimmermann telegram, sometimes called the Zimmermann note, does, it gets intercepted, right, by the British. And by the way, we did keep track, y'all, of every telegram that came in or went out of this country, okay, even if coded, in hopes that we could decode it later. That'll be important later when we look at the Venona papers, which show kind of what the Soviets were up to, that we only found out about, at least publicly, all of us in the 1990s. But anyway, so this was intercepted by the British, and they decoded it. Now, when decoded, y'all, this thing was shocking. First of all, it told Mexico, look, Mexico, if you join us in this war against the United States and keep the United States busy, Germany, when we win this war, will see to it that you get your territories back that you lost in the Mexican War. All you got to do is attack the United States, keep them busy while we fight the British and the French and the Russians who were kind of still in the war, even though they'd already had their February Revolution, but it looked like they might be leaving. Now, they don't quite understand their history. They imagine Kansas, for example, up here was part of it. But these, if you guys remember, are the territories that Mexico lost. They lost a good chunk of Texas. They lost California, although that wasn't promised. So basically what they're promising them back are some of the territories. New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, okay? All Mexico's got to do. Now, we don't know what Mexico would have done. I mean, sure, they were smart enough not to do it. But the British, y'all, were very careful. What they did was they knew this. They sat on it for a while. They waited for the Germans to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And they said, oh, did that get you mad, America? Unrestricted submarine warfare? Well, guess what? Germany's also trying to turn Mexico against you. So when these two things together, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmerman telegram trying to get our neighbor Mexico to attack us, this was too much. President Wilson abandons his neutrality. He goes in front of Congress, as presidents have to get a declaration of war. And it's a joint session. Both the Senate and House are there. President Wilson goes to Congress and he asks them to declare war on Germany. Okay, now remember, he had been elected just before this, y'all, in late 1916 on a platform where basically it said, he kept us out of war. In other words, if you want to stay out of war, re-elect President Wilson, or at least that's the implication. Didn't say he was promising, he said he kept us out of war. Didn't say he was going to keep us out forever. All righty? Now, not everybody was going to be in favor of this war, even with these things happening. Okay, now, as I said, many people were opposed to this war. A lot of the people who were opposed to it were populists, like William Jennings Bryan. As I said, he resigned as Secretary of State, thinking that Wilson had gone too far in his protest over the sinking of the Lusitania. But Jane Addams, remember the famous lady of Hull House? She was a peace activist. Jeanette Rankin, who had been the first woman ever elected to Congress. Here's a picture of Jeanette. By the way, she also was the only person to be opposed to our going into World War II, even after Pearl Harbor. She was a pacifist, no matter what the situation was. These people were fearful that progressivism, remember what you guys just studied, the unit y'all just did, would be a victim of World War I if we got into the war. Because everything changes when you're in war, right? A lot of civil liberties are thrown out the window. People only care about winning the war, and they forget about a lot of things. So, in fact, they were fearful it would do that. You are correct, sir. And you are correct, sir. Okay? Socialists such as Eugene V. Debs opposed the war. He would actually end up going to jail. Socialists believe, y'all, that wars are kind of capitalist things to kill off workers or to make money for the company. So they believed all socialist brothers should oppose the war and not fight and kill each other. That didn't go down so well, okay? But President Wilson, y'all, he did a speech in front of Congress, and his famous words you guys need to know was, the world must be made safe for democracy. The world must be made safe for democracy. Okay, I think I mistyped that there a little bit, but we got to make the world safe for democracy. That is the quote. We're going to be fighting for different reasons. We got to get rid of these kings, these dictators, like the Kaiser of Germany and the Emperor of Austria-Hungary and the Sultan of Turkey or whatever. Okay, now this opposition was in the minority, and Congress did vote to go to war. But if you notice this, y'all, 6 people in the Senate voted against the war, and here in the House of Representatives, 50 voted against the war. 373 voted for it, okay? And here you see a little article about Jeanette Rankin. Okie dokie, y'all, so there we go. Hard for it to say time to stop. Okay, can we go on now? Y'all got it? Now that's kind of too loud there. I'm sorry, y'all. But what they're playing there is a song called Over There, Over There. And that's a song that's synonymous with America in World War I, Over There. And the song says that, you know, over there, spread the word that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. And then they basically say, and they won't come back till it's over there. And that became sort of like the most famous song from the war. And I could see you guys using that in contextualization or talking about historical situation, setting sort of the stage or whatever. All right, so I do all this as Cajun man here, U.S. preparation, okay? Now, as you guys will see when we look at World War II in a few weeks here, America was not ready. In fact, I can't ever really think of a war that America has been ready for. America tries to be a country that doesn't like to have, at least we didn't used to like to have a large army. That was something early in our country's history that we were terrified of because we looked at a lot of nations around the world that had large armies, large what we call standing armies, permanent armies, and they often ended up having dictatorships. So America, which also had very few enemies, and one thing to remember, y'all, America has two big oceans on either side, right? We have the Atlantic on the east, the Pacific on the west, and this made many Americans think, why do we need an army? Why do we need a large Navy? Although, as you guys have seen, we did build up a Navy due to, you know, the Spanish-American War and all that, the influence of sea power. Huh? After national, let me move my picture here. The National Defense Act, sorry about that. And so America, y'all, is him, you know, President Wilson, even though he technically is saying he is not going to get into the war, like a lot of American presidents, he's promising not to get into war. It seems like all the presidents who promise not to get us into war seem to get us into war. But anyway, so Wilson is campaigning around the country, though, trying to build up the military before we enter the war. Even though, like I said, technically we're not in it. He doesn't want us to be any more unprepared than we have to be. Now, what's ironic is President Wilson has as his young Assistant Secretary of the Navy a man by the name of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, y'all, will be doing the same thing as Wilson 24 years later. When Roosevelt, as President of the United States, is trying to prepare and get the United States ready for World War II. So, you know, Roosevelt, y'all, gets kind of a dry run by watching kind of his hero, Woodrow Wilson, do this. So what Wilson wants, y'all, is to increase the military up to 175,000 men. Ultimately, y'all, we will have over 5 million men in uniform. He's also trying to build up 50 new ships. Now, what Wilson uses to do this, since a lot of people in Congress were opposed, Wilson is going to try to appeal to the people directly. He's going to hop on trains. He's going to go around the country speaking to people, urging them to talk to their congressman, to get their congressman to do this. Jump ahead 3 years later. Wilson is trying to get the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, which required us to join a United Nations-like organization, pass the same thing. He will go on a train tour, travel around trying to get that, and he'll end up having a stroke. But this was Wilson's sort of direct appeal, sometimes like over the heads of Congress. Congress people don't like it when you do that. They want you to work through them, not put pressure on them through the people. And so we would see marches like this, you know, trying to get people excited, people to volunteer, people to support the rearming and rebuilding. And we're going to see the same thing in World War II, y'all. World War II starts in Europe in 1939. And we walk kind of a very, very fine line, just like we did in World War I, trying to stay out of it. That would be a very easy kind of comparison, contrast, or type of essay that could have you guys write. Now, nevertheless, and despite all the lessons from American history before, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, and World War II, America is going to be largely unprepared. And even though we technically go to war in April of 1917, it's going to be a full year, really, till a large number of Americans can get there. And the thing is, we probably could have sent men over there piecemeal, and that's how the French and the British wanted us to do it, y'all. They're like, hey, give us 500,000 men. We'll use them to fill the ranks, our depleted ranks. We'll use them to fill in places. And General Pershing, who will be our general in charge of our forces in World War I, he's like, no, you're not going to use American boys like you've wasted European boys already. We will have our own units under our own command and do it that way, because he did not like how they had been fighting the war. So if we couldn't contribute by manpower for about a year, it would really be the second, well, it would be early 1918 before we could make a sizable difference. We had been supplying the Allies, and once we went into war, y'all, we stopped charging them for stuff. In fact, that's going to set up a big argument after the war. After the war, our allies, the French and the British, they expected that we would write off those debts of when we had sold them stuff before we were in the war. Now, once we got in the war, we gave them that stuff. We didn't charge them because we were on their side. But we don't do that. And that's going to set up a crisis after the war where we're going to demand that they pay us for this. They don't have the money, so they're going to squeeze Germany to try to get that money. And it's going to hurt the German economy and help, sadly, lead to the popularity and rise of Adolf Hitler. So some big consequences for that. So we supplied lots of ammo, lots of food to the Allies before we could get our men there. Okay, now this is President Wilson here. And as I said, he's largely unprepared for when we go to war. Okay, hopefully the sound will come on here soon. And I know in the recordings the sound doesn't come up too well, so I'm going to go ahead and go past that. Now, it seems like this wouldn't be part of American history. Why am I talking about the Russian Revolution? Because that plays a big role in the impact of that we have in this war. Now, the war had gone awful for Russia, okay? The Russians were notoriously unarmed. There are stories about 1 in 3 had weapons at the beginning of the war. 1 in 3 actually had bullets, and I don't know if it was the same guy or not, but they were terribly, terribly equipped. And so the Russians, y'all, did one thing during the early part of the war. That was lose battles and surrender tens of thousands of men. It was just awful. And so the people back home got restless. And finally, the Tsar, the leader of Russia, decides, hey, the reason they're not fighting is I'm not there. I'm going to go there, and they're going to fight for their holy Tsar. Well, he goes there, and the losses continue. Finally, there are protests and stuff going on like you see here at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. So what happens is he heads home, right? Well, as he's heading home, his train is stopped by protesters, and they don't let him advance another foot until he abdicates, until he gives up the throne. So the Tsar is out. Now, why is this important in American history? Because for Woodrow Wilson, y'all, he had said this was a war to make the world safe for democracy, right? How can you really say you're fighting for democracy if you have somebody like a Tsar with absolute power and control? But with the Tsar out and hopefully a democracy coming to Russia, it would be easier. But sadly, for Russia then and Russia today, that government did not last long. The big mistake that the government that took over from the Tsar, what we today call the provisional government, was the fact that it kept fighting the war. The Russian people were sick of the war. They were sick of the shortages of food. Women were protesting, mothers. You don't ever want to get mothers mad. You know, they were having bread riots and stuff. Now, meanwhile, in Switzerland was an exile by the name of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. But everybody remembered him better by his pen name, Lenin. Now, Lenin has been wanting to get back to Russia, but it's going to be kind of hard with the war going on because there's Germany between him and Russia. But the Germans, y'all, knowing that Lenin can play a big role, decide to let him travel in a sealed railroad car through Germany. They don't let him get out. They're afraid he's going to infect them with communism. And he makes his way to Finland. And from Finland, he makes his way to St. Petersburg. Now, what he promises the Russian people are 3 things: land, bread, but especially peace. And so when he comes to power in the second revolution of 1917, his party, the Bolsheviks, which today we call them the communists, they quickly make peace with the Germans. Why is this a big deal? Because just as America is getting in the war, y'all, Russia is getting out of the war. And this means all those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of German soldiers fighting the Russians can now be sent by train to attack the French. And so knowing that America is coming into this war probably because of the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and, of course, the decryption of the Zimmerman telegram and all that, Germany is in a hurry. They've got to knock the French and British out before Americans can get there in large enough numbers to make a difference. So in early 1918, the Germans launched what's called Operation Michael. It's this last desperate gamble, kind of like, if you know World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. They come close, y'all, to winning the war. They push, dozens and dozens of miles in from where the lines had been. They get close to Paris, and it looks like the Germans just might win the war before we can make a difference. But finally, at a place called Chateau Thierry, the Americans are there in large enough numbers to stop the German offensive and essentially, in a lot of ways, y'all, win the war. Now, as you guys saw in the movie, it's going to take a few more months for the war to finally be won. But this is the turning point. We're not there, or we don't do this, the Germans maybe win the war, and history is very, very different. So Americans can take a lot of pride in their soldiers at Chateau Thierry, as you guys also saw with Lost Battalion, Americans in the Argonne Forest. Okay, now, I personally find this stuff dull as can be, but AP loves this stuff. So you guys sadly have to know it. Now, during World War I, our government got more involved than it ever had trying to rule or run the economy. Now remember, under progressivism, for the first time, our government had started trying to regulate certain businesses, setting up certain standards like the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act and going after some of your big trusts and stuff. But never before had our government began to exercise more control. Now, one thing you guys will notice as you study history, you'll see it in World War II, you maybe even see it today. Anytime our country feels threatened, whether it was after 9/11 or during World War II, during the Civil War, Americans are willing to put up with more attacks on a lot of our freedom, right? You and I will let the government get away with stuff that we probably wouldn't have. We would have never allowed the government to do to the economy what it does in World War I and what it will do in World War II. And that's why this could be a good example for contextualization if you guys have to write about the New Deal and the Great Depression. Because in a lot of ways, y'all, this was kind of a dry run, getting Americans used to the government taking control of the economy. But because it was war, we let them do it. Now, one example that you have here, y'all, is what's called the War Industries Board. Now, what this basically did, y'all, is raw materials that were necessary for the war effort were taken over by this guy. You don't need to know his name, Bernard Baruch, but he basically took over the control of raw materials. The government told businesses what they could charge, okay? We're going to have the same thing during World War II, but even more so, where the government freezes prices, does all that kind of stuff. The government tells them, this is what you need to make before you make any of this, before you make any of this. And it was unbelievable kind of control. During the New Deal, you're going to see something called the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, that's going to do something similar like that. Now, also, labor is going to benefit quite a bit from the war. Now, remember, with the exception of Teddy Roosevelt's square deal, for the most part, labor had not gotten a fair deal. Usually the government, the Supreme Court, everybody sided on management, the owners of the factories. But during this war, we couldn't handle having strikes, y'all. If we're having strikes during a war and, we can't get our stuff made, we could lose the war. So we basically set up a board that requires management, the owners, the people that run the factories, and labor to sit down and not have strikes. And labor finds that it's got a lot of power. We need them. And so they get higher wages. They get the 8-hour day, okay? And this is going to set the stage for, once again, in the New Deal, when we set up what's called the National Labor Relations Board, which is going to also try to work with labor and prevent strikes and stuff. And it was relatively successful. Not very many strikes. But as soon as World War I comes to an end, y'all, there's going to be like nationwide strikes, and it's going to be crazy. Another thing that we did, and this affects you guys and me even to this day, during spring break a few weeks ago, you guys probably remembered when one Sunday morning you woke up and found out you had lost an hour, right? What you thought was 8 o'clock in the morning now was 9 o'clock. Well, what was that? Daylight savings time. And the reason they did that, y'all, is they needed to save energy. Most of America's electricity then was produced by burning coal. We needed coal for the war effort, for the ships, for the railroads, all those kind of things. So the idea was, if we jumped ahead an hour, people would be at work when light first happened. And that way they could work in the light. We wouldn't have to use so much electricity for light. They could work longer days. And we did it. What's weird though, y'all, is that we have kept this long. And I don't know if you followed the story or not, but there's been talk in the news about getting rid of daylight savings. A lot of people have talked about it. Yeah, maybe it will finally happen. Because, believe it or not, crime goes up, deaths, heart attacks, stroke goes up. People just kind of start freaking out. I mean, I like personally when we fall back and we get that extra hour, but it's not too cool when we lose that hour. But yeah, this is a legacy of the war, which hopefully, we will not be facing next year. Now, rail administration. Remember, we were a railroad nation. We didn't have big trucks yet. We didn't have the national highways. We didn't have, obviously airplanes that could carry things. And so we were a nation of rails. The government literally took over the railroads. They determine the times, they determine what they carried, they standardize all the equipment and the pay, okay? These were big, big changes, something that never would have happened without a war, okay? So, but this one I personally find the most interesting, and that's the food administration. Food administration. Now, what's interesting about this is it's the first time most Americans hear of a name that we'll be hearing a lot more about later, and that's Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, y'all, is probably one of the greatest tragedies in American history because most of his life, y'all, was spent doing humanitarian deeds for people. He was orphaned at a very young age. He went out to Stanford in California. He was in the first graduating class. He worked his way through college, didn't have any money at all. But by the time he was 30, he was already a millionaire several times over. He got involved in mining and everything like that. And then he decided to devote his life to public service. That was the idea. You make money, your country's given so much to you, you now give back. And so when World War I started, there was a lot of people. It was summer. A lot of people were over in Europe. Americans were tourists right over there. He finds a way to get them home, okay? Then during the war, when Belgium is going through heck and there's starvation and stuff, he gets food to feed the Belgians, and even after the war to feed the Germans, and then to feed the Russians when they were having their terrible, terrible famine. We have a terrible flood on the Mississippi in 1927. He takes care of that. And so eventually people decided, we need to get this guy president. He can fix anything. And ironically, he gets elected, y'all, and becomes president in March of 1929. In October of 1929, we get the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. Now, at first, and maybe he was a victim of his own and everybody's high expectations, maybe that's why it was so bad. But when it happened, everybody thought, oh man, dude, we're so lucky. We got Mr. Fix-It in there. And, the Depression, y'all, was just too much. We couldn't fix it by just voluntary efforts like had worked for him up to this point. And, he's going to end up being probably one of the most despised or disliked presidents. And yet everything else in his life, y'all, had been magic. So what did he recommend to try to save food for our soldiers? What he wanted to do was he told people, if you got someplace, you know, maybe on your balcony, on your roof, in your backyard, grow food, grow some food, because whatever you can eat, that saves us food to send to our soldiers and to send to the people of Europe. Save food, don't waste it. You know, I hate to say it, but we Americans are notorious for wasting lots of food, right? And so they made a series of posters to urge people to do this. Now, what's important to understand, and this only really occurred to me kind of recently, was that in World War I, they did this by voluntarism, right? They asked people, don't eat as much food, save your food, don't eat certain foods on certain days, and Americans did it. By the time World War II comes around 25 years later, guess what? They ain't asking volunteers anymore. Americans now are ready, maybe because of the New Deal, to be told you can't eat, you can only have this much sugar per month, you can only have this much meat per month, you can only have this much gasoline per month, and we went to forced rationing. But in World War I, we did it all by voluntarism, by appealing to people's patriotic duty. Now, one of the posters I like is this one right here. So let's zoom in on this one. Now, in this poster here, who is the audience? Who are they appealing to here, y'all? This would be a great poster to do sourcing of the audience on. Immigrants, exactly. How do you know they're immigrants? Bingo, exactly. They're looking at the Statue of Liberty, and that is the sign that they've reached America. And kind of the way that they're dressed, they're carrying everything, and they're like waving at it. You see the ship back there. And so it's reminding immigrants here, food will win the war. You, immigrants, came here seeking freedom. You must now help to preserve it. Wheat is needed for the Allies. Waste no food, okay? And like I said, they used voluntarism, and they got people to voluntarily, y'all, like say on Monday, no meat on Monday. Just one day a week, we're asking you to give up meat. Would y'all do that? Maybe. Yeah, we could do that. Okay. Wednesdays, no wheat products. No wheat at all. You just no breads, no cereals that have wheat in it. Cool. You know, and so one day a week, you would give up stuff. And this would, of course, increase the amount that we had for our soldiers. It also had an extra kind of impact, too, that people hadn't predicted. Anybody know what malted barley is used to make? Beer, right? Beer. Now, people also use wheat to make wheat beers. Some American beers even use some rice and other adjuncts and stuff like that. But the main products in beer are barley and wheat and things like that. So, if you want to be patriotic, what should you do? Drink less beer, right? Yeah. And so you drink less beer and all that. And besides, who's famous for their beer? The Germans. So you're like, it's a double kind of thing. Being patriotic means drinking less. And ultimately, this would result in prohibition of alcohol towards the end of the war. Now, the next thing to talk about here, y'all, is what's called conscription or the draft. Now, when this war started, once again, we appealed to patriotism. Now, this poster here, the audience, I want you. What particular group does this man want, y'all? What age group would you say? 18 to 30 or so years old. He's not interested in Mr. D. You know, Mr. D is too old. So he's appealing to young people, or maybe he's even appealing to young women to put pressure. Because there were a lot of people, y'all, that if they saw you as kind of a healthy young guy walking around, they wondered, hey, why aren't you doing your part? Why aren't you in the Army? What's the matter with you? You ain't American? And so this poster, y'all, got about 2 million Americans to volunteer. As you guys saw in Lost Battalion, two of those characters, remember, kind of gave each other a hard time because they had volunteered. Now, it took a while for the numbers to happen, but eventually 2 million joined. Sadly, that was not nearly enough. Now, just to remind you of these posters here, this is a poster from England. This is Lord Kitchener, like kitchen with an ER. Lord Kitchener's poster came out in 1914 or 15. And of course, as you can see, our famous Uncle Sam poster, which is memed all the time and everything like that, is basically a copy of that poster. This is by James Montgomery Flagg up here. Now, in 1917, just after we went to war, President Wilson very reluctantly decides to invoke what's called selective service. It's a nice word for the draft. Now, only once before in our country's history had we had a draft. During the Civil War, we relied a lot on volunteers, but finally that wasn't enough. And so we started demanding that people serve in the war. Now, it did not go well at all. For one thing, there was lots of loopholes. During the Civil War, if you paid $300, you could get a substitute. So what does this mean? $300 back then is probably like, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 or something today. Only the rich people could get out. So once again, poor people had to fight this war. And ironically, in the South, y'all, you could be drafted, but if you had like, I think it was 25 or more slaves, you didn't have to fight. So it's like they're fighting a war for slavery, but the guys with the slaves, they're not having to fight. Now, most of them did, but it was just the idea. So anyway, in the Civil War, when we tried to have a draft, y'all, there had been riots, especially in New York City, where we had what was called the New York City draft riots. 3 days, y'all, of protests, very violent protests by Irish people largely. The Irish, by being poor, could not afford substitutes. And so when they got drafted, they got angry. And sadly, they took their anger out on African Americans, feeling like they're the reason for this war. And I'm going to go fight and get them free. And then they're going to come up here as free people and take away my crappy job. And so they attacked, and it was the largest single protest and riots in our country. I mean, it made the thing that happened with George Floyd look like nothing, y'all. I mean, this happened, it was just awful. A good chunk of New York was burned down. So they were leery about doing the draft for World War I. Now, there were protests, but nothing to the level that happened then. Now, at first, it was 21-year-olds to 30. Remember, you could only vote if you were 21 years or older. Later, though, as we need more people, we drop it to 18 and raise it to 35. Now that Mr. D is long past 35, y'all, I think the draft is a great idea. I think we need to bring it back. But anyway, but the thing is, these men had to serve. Now, it was done by lottery. And we would continue this, y'all. We would get rid of it in the years between the war. We would bring it back during World War II. We'd get rid of it shortly. And then the Cold War, we would bring back the draft for men again, all the way through to the end of Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War finally gets rid of the draft because we felt like it wasn't really fair. You know, your richer kids, your better connected kids found ways to get out of the war. Whereas your poor kids, often minority kids at a disproportionate number, were the ones that had to go fight. And of course, lots of times get killed or wounded. Now, so how's the lottery work? Well, this is the kind of lottery Mr. D would win. Basically what they do is they took like a big fishbowl, they put in dates like June 6th, December 12th, May 1st, and they just piled them up in there. And then they had a blindfolded person put his hand in there, and he would draw out a number. All right, let's say he draws out December 16th. December 16th gets a 1. All right, everybody between those ages, born on December 16th, they're going in first. Yeah. I was thinking it was that one. I was close, huh? They're trying to get you. They draw the next one, December 17th. And you're going in, you're number 2. The next day, May 1st, number 3. Maybe April 3rd, my birthday, number 4. Now, if your birth date had a high number like 300, 250, you knew you probably weren't going to get called in. But if you drew if your birth date was a low draft number, yeah, you're probably going to serve. So almost 3 million more people. Altogether, 5 million men, y'all, ultimately went off to fight in this war. Of course, that's small compared to the crazy numbers in World War II, but much, much smaller or much bigger than what we have today in it. Now, once again, the draft was controversial, although not to the extent it had been in the Civil War. And I just want to mention this too, because I do kind of like to make connections for y'all. One of the biggest reasons the Vietnam War was so unpopular, y'all, was the draft. Now, like I said, we got rid of the draft after the Vietnam War. We also lowered the voting age to 18, because think about it, y'all. I could be 18 and be drafted, but I can't help select the people who are going to send me to war for 3 more years. So they're asking me to die when I can't vote for the people who are asking me to die. And so we do lower the voting age to 18. But another thing is, when you have the draft, you know, there's a chance that all of us might have to go. And you care a lot more about the war. Now, you guys lived through some of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Those wars, a lot of us got kind of tired of them. We wanted them ended. But you didn't see a lot of the protests like you saw in Vietnam, or even that you saw in World War I. Because the guys in Afghanistan and Iraq, y'all, they're volunteers. And what do a lot of people kind of think, I hate to say? They're like, well, they're not sending me because I'm not volunteering. And the guys that are over there, hey, dude, you signed up. And, you know, if we'd had a draft, y'all, most political scientists and historians believe those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan would never have lasted as long, because people would have just said, no, man, I ain't going, and you would have had that. But you didn't have that kind of resistance. So there was a draft, and it did get controversial to a point, especially among pacifists, people who were opposed to war. And our old friend, Eugene Debs, the guy who led the Pullman strike, the guy who led the IWW, the socialist guy, Eugene Debs makes his last stand in American history. He opposes the war, he opposes the draft, and as a result, he will get thrown into jail. Right, now I'm just going to kind of skip ahead here a little bit. Do I need to go back? I heard somebody kind of, okay. So Eugene Debs is one of the big men who opposed it. Also a man by the name of Schenck will oppose it. Some people pronounce it Schink, I think, or Skank, or whatever. It sounds like a funky name. Anyway, and he will oppose the draft, and he'll actually go to jail for it as well. But that's a whole separate case that we'll talk about another time. All right, financing the war. Now, if you thought that other stuff was boring, wow, wait till this. But once again, AP loves this stuff, okay? Now, once again, this is a great poster to look to for audience, especially for purpose. This is a great poster for point of view that you guys could use if you had it in a document-based question or something like that. What is the person at the top, y'all, there? Who is that, or what is that? It's a German soldier. How do you know he's German? He's got the pointy helmet. Remember I told y'all that would be useful? All right, let's zoom in on this dude. Oh, we'll come back to that in just a sec. Here you see the Liberty Bonds. I'll talk about that in just a sec. This is a parade where they're trying to raise money in New York for the war effort. So you have a parade, you go to the parade. There, of course, you're expected to buy bonds. Now, what's a Liberty Bond? It's basically you and I use our money, we loan it to the government to fight the war, and then when the war is won, years later, they pay us back with interest. You still can loan money to the government in what's called treasury bonds to this day. You're never going to get rich off of treasury bonds, although they did pay for my first wedding. Yeah. I bought them when I was in, what, 5th or 6th grade, and kept them until I was, what, about 30? And they paid for my wedding. But anyway, all right. Now, so anyway, these were called Liberty Bonds. And I put on here largely false atrocity stories. I don't want to say they were false, but they were really exaggerated. Germans did do terrible things to a lot of the people in Belgium and in northern France. Obviously, nothing to the extent that they did during the Holocaust of World War II. But they shot innocent civilians. They did some awful things. And of course, it was the fact that they had done some of that that allowed the propaganda stories to be built around it. And before the propaganda stories were over, y'all, there were stories about German soldiers stabbing babies with their bayonets and tossing them around like, you know, they're bales of hay or something, okay? I mean, surely nobody did that. but that became a story. Stories about them crucifying soldiers, rendering bodies down into fat and stuff. So let's zoom in on this guy. I think I got a picture of him coming up here. All right, maybe that comes up later. But so the way it works is, let's say I give the government $50. They give me a piece of paper that says, we owe you $50. And in 5 years, 10 years or whatever, we'll pay you back the $50 plus maybe another $10 or $20 in interest. And to do this, y'all, they used American celebrities, although he's actually British. They used Charlie Chaplin and they used other actors and actresses. They would hold rallies to try to get people to come there and donate. And then, of course, we also printed a lot of money. Now, this is one of the little silent films, because they were silent in those days, that you would see before you saw a movie. That's obviously supposed to represent, that's your liberty, eh? Who's that guy? That's the German, the Kaiser, right? He's trying to take liberty away. But look what happens, just in the nick of time. An American doughboy shows up to save liberty. And I'll go ahead and let those play, and I will see you guys. Some of you maybe Saturday, the rest of you I'll see on Tuesday. Have a good Easter. Hopefully you get lots of chocolate and eggs and stuff like that. All right, so when we look at this cartoon as well, too, y'all, a similar one, the Germans are portrayed as basically gorillas, much like that previous picture showed them as this some lower than human form. So it says, destroy this mad brute. Now remember, for documents to get your sourcing points, y'all, you guys need to either talk about the context, you could talk about the atrocities, for example, that led to this, or whatever. You need to talk about the, or you could talk about the author, the intended audience. We'll talk about that in just a sec. The purpose, remember purpose and the audience often go together. Or you could talk about the point of view. What does this person believe? Where are they coming from? Okay, so let's look at this cartoon in some detail. And when you guys if you do, you usually get at least one picture in your DVQs. You know, tear it apart. You can't cut it up like I do, but you can definitely zoom in your own mind and look at stuff. So when we look at this guy's face, right, obviously he's a brute. He represents the Germans as well, German militarism. He's got the pickelhaube with the spiked helmet. Anytime you see that, y'all, dead giveaway that it's the Germans in World War I. Now, the beauty of teaching this class is, as long as I have since the last millennium, is that I noticed different things on pictures that I'd never noticed it before. I didn't notice really until this year, literally the drops of spit coming off the guy. I mean, obviously you see the fangs, but he's got spit, you know, saliva dripping from him like some wild, rabid beast. But this is what I just noticed last period. What is this, y'all, on his face? He's got a mustache. Who else had a mustache like that? The Kaiser of Germany. So he is literally, the Kaiser, y'all, is being portrayed as a brute, okay? Now, we zoom in here too, y'all, and we see that same image of a destroyed city. And particularly, what kind of building do you think this could be? It's a church. And if you're not sure, look at the little kind of curved arches here, are the pointed Gothic arches that you see on a lot of your European churches. And people back then would have been able to recognize that as probably a destroyed church. Now, Americans, y'all, had always felt safe from European affairs because there was this big Atlantic Ocean on one side and a larger Pacific Ocean on the other side. All we had to worry about, y'all, was Canada and Mexico. Not really big threats, right? But if you notice something here, look at where this gorilla, this mad brute is. Where is he? He's in America. He has crossed that ocean. No longer are you and I safe because of the ocean. This brute has come here. And let's look at his club that he's got there. His club says culture on it. Culture. What do you think that means in English? Culture, right? Now, that is meant as an ironic kind of statement, right? This is something that definitely points out the point of view of this particular artist who did this. You know, whereas Germans were believed to be, and this is before World War II, right? The Holocaust, the terrible thing that the Germans have done in World War II are still in the future. But still, what they've done in Belgium, what they've done in northern France, y'all, is enough to make their claim to being a cultured people a complete lie. Look at the end of this club, y'all. It is literally with blood, brains, flesh all over it. Look at the guy's hands, or paws might be a better word for it since he's a brute. They're bloody too, okay? Kind of picking up where that other guy left off, although at least the other guy had a rifle with a bayonet. This guy is using just plain brute force, and he's coming to you. Now, a way to maybe anticipate who he's particularly targeting. He's trying, the purpose, y'all, of this is to do what? Get American men to enlist, to join the U.S. Army. But particularly, he's appealing to a particular group of men, okay? Because obviously, and I'm not going to zoom in on the lady since she's having a wardrobe malfunction here in this picture. But this lady, y'all, obviously is probably about to be raped if she hasn't been. She's going to be molested by this brute. And they're really trying to appeal to your manly virtues. If you're a guy, they're basically saying, join or else. What? Your sister, your mother, your wife, your girlfriend could be the next victim of this awful guy. And you see her just going, oh no, right? And he's got his bloody paws all over her. So quite shocking, but probably very effective. You know, hey, if you're not joining, you're helping these people maybe come over here and take our women. So it's a very, very useful cartoon, I think, or poster. All right, so now, y'all, we move to talk about the home front. AP in every war loves to ask about how did this war impact the people back home, what we call the home front. Now, women are one of the favorite groups. Remember, one way to get complexity points, y'all, is to really narrow down your focus, or you can talk about generalities, but mention, okay, so how did this event impact women? Did it impact them differently, or in a in a very different manner? And the impact, was it more, or how did it impact different ethnic groups, or how did it impact different parts of the country or different sections? If you can explain that in your essays, whether DBQs or LEQs, they love that stuff. So they like to ask about the impact of the war on women. Now, ever since the American Revolution going into the Civil War, for the most part, women stayed home during the war, right? They had the traditional jobs of women to take care of the family, take care of the kids, be good wives. And if the family had a business, if the family had a farm, that was their job to keep that running. And indeed, that's what most wives did during World War I. But if you go back to even the Civil War, we began to start seeing women working in the war factories. Now, this is actually a British poster, but it's of course encouraging women to work on artillery. Now, you guys saw the movie Lost Battalion, and you saw the terrible trench fighting and everything like that. But World War I was mainly an artillery war. More people died, y'all, as a result of artillery blasts than anything else. So notice it's saying here, on her, their lives depend. In other words, she better do her job. These women munition workers. And this could be quite a deadly job, y'all, because these shells could explode. The biggest thing that women did during the war, and World War II, y'all, with Rosie the Riveter, remember the "we can do it" thing that we saw at the beginning of the school year? A big thing, y'all, was for women to work in the factories, and that way men would be freed up to go serve in combat. Up to this point, y'all, I mean, really up until y'all's lifetime, women were not allowed to serve in combat. There were beliefs that the women were not physically able to do it. There was also the fear that what would happen to a woman if she got captured, right? There was this fear of her being sexually mistreated and all kinds of things like that. During Desert Storm in 1991, we let women fly in combat for the first time. And one woman pilot got shot down and was captured, and a lot of people were very upset and worried about what was happening. I know it sounds sexist, but that's how people viewed it. But today, women can serve in combat in most fields, and that's only changed in y'all's lifetime. So what could women do? Well, they could work in the factory. Some women served as translators. Some women served as stenographers, or basically secretaries, to write down stuff, speeches and letters, and then type them up. Women served as phone operators and did that. But as you'll see in this video, perhaps one of the biggest contributions of women were working as nurses. Women also, y'all, had to keep the farms going, and this could be particularly difficult, in some of in the circumstances I'll show you. Now, this is what a war factory would have looked like. You can see it's almost all women on the floor there. Occasionally, you'll see a man, and notice, y'all, the men are in what role? They're watching them. They're the overseers. They're the bosses. And it's ironic, y'all, my neighbor who's catty corner from me, he's like 98 years old, okay? And during the war, he lived in Chicago, and he worked in a factory that employed women. And his job was basically to be their boss, to monitor their work, and that's what he did for most of the war until the end when he went and served. So it's kind of interesting how it's men being the overseers, but it's women doing the work. You can also see that they're using a lot of natural light. And this is the reason, y'all, we went to daylight savings time. Not so you and I would save daylight for when we got home. The idea was get the workers in the factory when the sun first comes up so that we can maximize the number of hours that they have light, which will make it easier and better for them to do it. Now, another interesting thing comes out of the war, and that is the ideal woman. Now, pretty much, y'all, since America's founding, men's idea, and perhaps women, if they wanted to please men, their idea of the perfect woman had been a woman with long, long hair, often piled up on her head like a little hair helmet, wearing tremendous amounts of clothes, right? Having a dress, a petticoat underneath it, a corset, lots and lots of fabric. I mean, you could actually measure the fabric in square yards that these poor ladies had. But because of the war effort, the desire to save on material, and this is duplicated again during World War II, y'all, the dresses start getting lighter. The dresses start getting shorter. Like if you look on this lady here, you could see her ankles. Believe it or not, you wouldn't even have been able to see the ankles before the war. And by the time the 20s come around, y'all, you're going to see a lot more. I mean, you're going to be able to see knees and stuff like that. The other thing, too, women's hairstyles change. Women start getting shorter hair because they had to cut it to work in the factory, because you don't want that hair to fall into the machinery or to get caught in the machinery and maybe tear your scalp off. So there's all kinds of interesting consequences. Now, these women are filling up shells. These are shells here that they will fill up with explosives. They look kind of like maybe an 18-pounder or something like that. And of course, after filling them, they'll fill them up in these boxes. Here it looks like you have a man back here, once again, overseeing these women workers. Can't imagine that kind of job. It'd be awfully dangerous to do what those ladies are doing. But that was a role. Now, in the fields, on the farm, women had to do the job of not just men, but as this picture suggests, sometimes even farm animals. Because if you look at England and France, a lot of the farm animals, y'all, were drafted too, right? If you've ever got a chance, y'all, to see the movie War Horse, War Horse really does a great job showing you the role that animals played in the war. If I ever get too happy, I'll just put War Horse on to bring me back down sometimes. You know, because it's pretty sad seeing what the poor horse goes through in the war. And so these women are literally pulling the plow themselves.
When the U.S. ended the war, the country suddenly needed large numbers of women as much as it needed soldiers. Whereas men were needed to fight in the trenches, women were needed as nurses, as translators, stenographers, and switchboard operators. Supplying the army with uniforms called thousands of seamstresses. Women enrolled in the Army, Navy, and even Marines. Nurses volunteered in the Red Cross and YMCA. Sources report that nearly 20,000 Red Cross nurses served in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, capital overseas. Female Salvation Army volunteers worked as nurses at the frontline canteen serving hot meals, donuts, and coffee to soldiers. Ordinary girls in towns all over America suddenly had a chance at a different life, the prospect of traveling to Europe to be an important part of the war effort. Among the thousands of women volunteering in France were many daughters of privilege.
A lot of your wealthy girls served.
Girls in elite women's institutions like Smith College volunteered together. Newspapers like Stars and Stripes played up the society girls with bold and Harris scrubs tubs to aid U.S. February 1918. Society girl wields brush and soap as her war weapons. The newspaper stories about rich girl volunteers were propaganda for sure. Also true. They weren't allowed to fight like their brothers in the Lafayette Escadrille.
That was a Air Force squadron.
A chance for a bigger life. The Army head nurse wrote, "Some of the most conscientious and hardest workers in my unit are girls who had done nothing all their lives but fritter away their time in society. The war woke them up. And the girls of good education, they had never thought much about the stern realities of life until America got into the war and they suddenly saw a chance to do something useful."
Some of the women acted as spies. In fact, There's the famous Mata Hari, who was a spy for the Germans against the French. She ultimately would be caught and she would be executed. There was an English nurse, Edith Clavell, who was believed to be helping English and French and Belgian soldiers, and she was executed by the Germans. So some of these women, y'all, paid with their lives for their work as well. Now, another, and then we've mentioned as well, like you saw from the video, nurses, a lot of these women. So a lot of these women, y'all, served as ambulance drivers as well. Here you see a British woman serving as an ambulance driver. That can be quite dangerous. Not only did women serve as ambulance drivers, but some Americans volunteered. And when we talked the other day, y'all, about the armistice, right? In November, I mentioned Ernest Hemingway, the great writer. I even mentioned Walt Disney, and both of these men, y'all, to their credit, volunteered even before America entered the war to go over and do their bit to help. I mean, imagine, y'all, if we'd lost Walt Disney in the war, our world would be quite different. Okay, and here's, of course, one of his cartoons that he drew, or a little kind of picture he drew, because even back then he was drawing pictures and stuff. Okay, now another thing AP loves to ask about is the war's impact on different ethnic groups. African Americans are ones that you often are asked to write about or to be aware about. Remember, that's a great way to go for that complexity point, if you can differentiate the impact of various things. Now, in the Civil War, for the first time since the American Revolution, African Americans served, but there was a catch. They had to serve with white commanders. Now, if you've ever, and we'll talk more about that when I review and go over the Civil War, but you had groups like the famous 54th Massachusetts that served. The Marines did not allow African Americans in them to serve, okay? Now, there was an interesting impact, though, during this war. This is an example of what we call cultural diffusion. Now, a lot of these African Americans were musicians, particularly this one guy by the name of Hayward, y'all. He literally recruited some of the best jazz musicians in New York so that he would have the best band around. Now, as these men went overseas, a lot of them brought their jazz records. There was even something, y'all, called the trench phonograph that was small enough and light enough that you could take it and in the trenches play your music. Well, French soldiers, British soldiers, French civilians began to hear this American art form called jazz, and a big jazz age sweeps not just the United States after World War I. In fact, the 1920s, as we'll start looking at them Thursday and Friday, become known as the jazz age, but it sweeps through Europe. Now, the most famous of all African American units, if you're asked to talk about African American units in World War I, you will want to mention the Hellfighters, or the Harlem Hellfighters, because they fought like hell. And most of them were from the Harlem area, which is predominantly black in New York City. A lot of these guys, y'all, had been in gangs, they'd been street fighters, and they had a reputation of being very, very tough. And some of them distinguished themselves, winning all sorts of medals during the war. Now, what happens, though, and this is something you can contrast with what happens in World War II. When they were over in Europe, the French, in a lot of ways, treated them as equals. The French valued them, whereas we tended to try to make a lot of them serve as cooks or chefs or ditch diggers and things like that. And the French treated them pretty well. French women treated them pretty well. And so when you're treated well for a while, you kind of forget maybe how you have been treated before. And when a lot of these guys returned, especially those that returned to the American South, they were not treated as well and were disappointed. Now, during World War II, a similar thing's going to happen. But the African American soldiers in World War II had kind of learned from the experience of their fathers. They made it clear that they were fighting for what they called the double V, victory over fascism abroad, but also victory over racism back home. And a lot of people really date the African American civil rights movement to basically World War II, with people like Jackie Robinson, who later became very famous as a baseball player. When he was at Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, he was asked to give up his seat to an officer's wife. He refused to do so and was court-martialed. So you start seeing African Americans beginning to challenge their second-class status a lot more as a result of World War II, because of what they had learned in World War I. Now, the thing is, too, it doesn't only impact African American soldiers, but African Americans as a whole also changed a great deal. Now, when I was here on Saturday, I talked about what's called the Sun Belt. Now, during World War II and the years after World War II, we have kind of the opposite thing happen. A lot of Northerners, whites and some blacks, began to move back to the South, because during World War II, y'all, a lot of our bases, especially air bases, and a lot of our factories were located in the American South as well as the West. But in World War I, it was just the opposite. In World War I, your factories, most of them were up north. The South, y'all, was still largely agricultural. So in World War I, a lot of African Americans decided there are much better jobs up north. For example, Henry Ford began to offer all employees a minimum of $5 a day. Didn't matter what your race was. You did the work, you got $5 a day, which is probably equivalent today to around $100 or $90 a day, which was awfully good money for the folks back then. And enough African Americans moved to Detroit that they started calling it Motown, for Motor Town, because of the cars there. But you also saw large numbers of blacks moving to the north, like in New York. Chicago became another big area, a destination for them. And they wanted better jobs. They wanted to get away from their sharecropper type jobs they had in the American South, but also they were hoping to escape the racial Jim Crow laws, which, if you remember the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, made it legal to separate black men from white men and black women from white women in theaters and schools and places like that. Now, if they hoped that the North would not be racist, they were mistaken. It was racist in a lot of ways, just maybe not as clearly or as supported by law, but there were some differences. Now, we call this move up north the Great Migration, or sometimes called the Great Black Migration. And it's also going to pave a way, y'all, for a phenomenon we'll talk about in the 1920s called the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of African American artists lived in Harlem, and their art, their music becomes known to a much wider audience. And that may have never happened had it not been for this Great Black Migration. Really started during the war and continuing up until the Great Depression. Now, the thing is too, and I hope you guys can kind of understand this. This is kind of different. And I'll just give you guys a personal experience of my own. When I was a kid, I lived in Louisiana and I lived in Mississippi. I lived in Mississippi in 1969, 1970 there. I didn't go back to Mississippi for a lot of years, and I went back in the 80s. And I was really surprised to see how African Americans, a lot of them that I encountered, behaved differently towards whites. For example, and this was weird for me. I was a kid in college, but they would say, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," and act very, and I was like, wow, that kind of makes me feel kind of weird and uncomfortable. But Mississippi, y'all, had been one of the most racist and the toughest states for African Americans in this country. And to survive, they really kind of had to learn survival skills, how to act, how to avert your eyes from white women, for example, how to walk on the sidewalks differently. And it was part of what they had to do. Whereas up north, a lot of African Americans didn't have to do that. They didn't quite know how to, quote, how to behave. So what starts to happen during World War I is when we start gathering men to be in African American units, they start making their way down south to be trained here. Well, white Americans in the South expected the northern blacks to act like southern blacks did, and you start having some conflicts and problems. And this is going to culminate in something happening in our own city. A lot of people in Houston aren't even aware of what became known as the Camp Logan Mutiny or the Camp Logan riots. Now, Houston was a much, much smaller city then. We didn't even expand to where the Loop is today. There was no Loop. In fact, if you went out to like Wayside, y'all, you were out in the country. If you went to where Memorial Park is today, you were out in the country. So when we needed a place to train soldiers, we began having them work in this forested area that today is Memorial Park. It was called Camp Logan. Now, African American units were brought there for training, and pretty soon conflicts began to happen. Now, what ends up happening, and we'll go over the causes of it, or I'll let you see a video in just a sec that shows you some of the causes of it. African American soldiers riot. They grab their guns, they defy their white officers, and they go on a rampage downtown, shooting whites, killing some police officers particularly. And when it was all over, about 12 to 20 whites had died or been wounded. And ultimately, when this mutiny, as we called it, was put down, 40 black soldiers were charged with it. Some of them were undoubtedly guilty, right? But there were some that were just in the wrong place at the wrong time that had not shot anybody. But there was a real rush to justice. Now, these 40 men were taken to Fort Sam Houston, which is in San Antonio. They were given a very quick court martial. And when it was all said, 13 of them were hanged. Okay. Now, I'm just going to fast forward here a little bit through some of this. Let's see here.
Training. Local whites declared they would not stand for black soldiers, expecting to be treated as equal.
This was down in South Carolina.
The Army went back to Camp Hill on Long Island, where the other New York units were training. Discrimination continued. The unit reached France. The commander of the American expedition, General Pershing, made it clear that these Negroes were going to be laborers and not combat troops. They could be chefs or dock workers. Black combat units were out of the question. Even though Pershing had commanded black troops before the war, politically he was urged not to anger white soldiers and press.
Especially Southerners.
The Army also insisted on strict orders that black troops were not to mix with French civilians. Not even a handshake was and to especially stay away from French women.
Ooh la la.
Most of the soldiers recoiled from months of dock workers. The U.S. Army didn't know what to do with them. The French did. By 1917, the French Army had practically bled to death. They had suffered nearly a million casualties, and there had been mutinies by the soldiers refusing to be sent into the slaughter. France already had non-white colonial troops on all borders of South Africa, from Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Vietnam. French soldiers accepted them as comrades in arms, even if they weren't considered equals in French society. They needed soldiers and did not care. 15th Heavy Foot became the 369th Regiment. The 369th were among the first American soldiers to fight in the trenches. They were in combat months before most of the U.S. Army. The French were impressed with the fighting. Maybe it's because the men were from the rough streets of New York, but observers saw something special about the hell. In close combat with bayonets and knives, they were unstoppable. The American press started changing its tune. One of the first combat heroes in the U.S. papers was Henry Johnson of the Hellfighters. Reportedly shot and attacked by a German platoon, Johnson was credited with killing at least 4 Germans with a knife and driving back the enemy. He was the first American soldier of any race to be awarded France's Croix de Guerre. The War Cross. Bravery and charisma started to replace those negative images seen in print just a year earlier. Many of these newspaper reporters started noting that the African American soldiers had the best spirits in the armed forces.
That's his gas mask.
It was noted by the French that one of the traits they helped fight abroad was urban fighting. In a war of charges in the open space between trenches dug through farm fields, the Harlemites specialized in fighting the Germans street by street in the towns and villages that the German army had captured and been fortified for years. It was recorded that during combat, the French general gave an order to retire. Colonel Hayward of the Hellfighters said, "My men never retire. They go forward or die, and we are going through here or heaven. You don't go back." At the end of the war,
Okay, so when they come back, they're given parades and things like we said, but things change. Now, we probably won't have time to see y'all packing up here, but I just want to mention some of the incidents that led to the Camp Logan riots, or the so-called Houston Mutiny of August 1917. As I said, there were African-American soldiers here, and they would go into town and things like that. Now, the fourth ward then, as it is today, was predominantly black. And a couple of young black kids were playing dice, right? They were shooting dice. And this police officer who had a reputation of being very anti-black, he chased these kids and he chased them into a house. Now the mother, or I don't know if she was the mother of them or whatever, the guy came in there. She was mad at him that he came in through the house. She started yelling at him or whatever. Eventually a black soldier nearby heard it. He came into her defense and he got pistol whipped by these two particular Houston policemen. And then later, when this guy was taken, another black officer, this was actually a sergeant, I think, he was also beaten. Now, word reached the African-American soldiers that these men had died, that they had died of their wounds. It wasn't true. They'd been beaten, but fortunately they had not died. But that's all that was needed. A lot of these men went and grabbed guns. They went onto the streets of Houston. They stopped cars. They shot people. They shot and killed like a young boy and wounded another one. They killed several police officers before this could be put down. But it obviously shows their anger at the situation at the time, and it's become famous. So if you're asked to talk about African Americans in World War I, to mention the Camp Logan riots would probably be a good thing. All right, that's it, y'all. Have a good day. All righty, so we're recording this. Hopefully it will come out okay to have for people who are absent or whatever, for posterity, or my posterity. Anyway, thank you, Janelle, for laughing. It's one person in this classroom that got that. All right, so as I was mentioning yesterday, y'all, it's kind of natural that during a time of national peril, or what we perceive to be peril, we see our government taking extra steps, things that we would have never believed that they would do. We've seen it during COVID. A lot of people believe the government has kind of overreached in some of its dictates to you and me about what we need to do, closing churches, schools, whatever. I don't know how history will look back at us for having done it that way. I mean, maybe it'll be understandable. We didn't know much about the disease. But during World War I, we had a definitely pretty crazy view of what the German threat was. Now, I would agree, World War II, yeah, the Germans were really that serious a threat, but we kind of went overboard, in my personal opinion anyway, with our characterization of the Germans as just absolutely barbarians, okay? So we used artists. We used people like that to do anti-German, pro-American propaganda. We also used the 4 Minutemen. This was, of course, harking back to the days when we had Minutemen during the American Revolution. These were American volunteers who allegedly in a minute could be ready to fight. Well, I guess these guys needed 4 minutes. And in that 4 minutes, y'all, they could explain why we were fighting the war. They had to be listened to. Most commonly, they spoke at movie theaters, but they could stop you on the street like, "Sir, do you know why we're fighting this war?" "Well, yeah, I do." "Well, let me tell you," and they would go into the spiel. And you really had to listen to them or you might be perceived as anti-patriotic. Here's just a little brief. I don't think we saw this video yesterday, did we? Yes. We did see it. Okay, cool. So I don't have to show that. All right. So we really kind of go overboard, y'all. And this is something you guys can always kind of expect whenever we have, like I say, this kind of moment of national peril. Now, in World War II, there's going to be some anti-German feelings, but nothing compared to the anti-Japanese hysteria of World War II. In World War I, by the way, the Japanese were an ally, okay? Now, the American Protective League is formed, and this American Protective League, y'all, is basically kind of volunteers. I guess we kind of call them Karens today, so to speak, whose job was to go out there and catch people doing wrong things, catch people saying unpatriotic things, spy on teachers, and all kinds of things like that. Now, they helped an organization called the Bureau of Investigation, and its young leader, J. Edgar Hoover. And that organization would ultimately morph into the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. So the FBI has its birth, y'all, in basically, World War I kind of hysteria. Now, to be honest, there were German spies here. We caught them. They were legit spies here. There were also real German saboteurs who did try to blow up or mess up some of our factories, y'all. And so, as always, there was a little bit of truth there, but people took it, to another degree. Kind of like the same thing with the Second Red Scare. There were communists in the U.S. military. There were communists in Hollywood and in our diplomatic, departments and stuff like that. But of course, people took it and exaggerated that fear and used it. Now, they really mounted an anti-German thing. You got to remember, y'all, after English and Irish people, German people were our biggest immigrants in this community or in this country. And for example, you saw people smashing the windows, trashing the businesses of some German Americans. Some of those people, y'all, had been here, their families had been here for 80 years or more, since the 1840s or so. And so you saw that. And, I hate to say it, but there's even been some reports, fortunately very few, of some Americans attacking Russian American businesses. One of the most ironic was a guy serves Russian food and has a Russian restaurant because it's better known, but he's a Ukrainian guy. And people canceled things and they smashed or they painted on his windows. So we're not immune to this kind of hysteria, and it's sad, but people do it. Kind of ironic, yeah. Now, if you think that's bad, we actually banned our orchestras from playing Beethoven. Yeah, no more Ludwig van. I mean, can you imagine? That's like half of the good classical music. Yeah. And then we banned this guy too, Bach, right? No more Brandenburg concertos. One of my all-time favorite pieces of music. Now, Mozart was okay because he's Austrian. And we didn't hate the Austrians as much. So yeah, no Bach, sorry. Yep. Now, believe it or not, some German foods were renamed. This is where it gets crazy, y'all. Crazy talk. Sauerkraut, one of the bad names you could call a German was a kraut, because they liked eating kraut so much. And this is sauerkraut. If you've never seen it, I hope I never see it again. I hate that stuff. Oh. It's cabbage and vinegar. Yeah. Two great things that don't go great together. You like it? My wife grows it, and see, I don't like coleslaw either. So those of you that do, more power to you. I will, if we ever find ourselves at a restaurant together, I will share my sauerkraut and cabbage and coleslaw with y'all. Okay? We should. I would love that, right? Y'all will make it just because of that. Like, hey, Mr. D, I brought sauerkraut for everybody. Sauerkraut was renamed, y'all, Liberty Cabbage. Liberty Cabbage? Hey, can I have some of that Liberty Cabbage? German measles became Liberty measles. You would think, if all things, we'd give the Germans their measles, right? Like, hey, that's a bad thing, right? So call it after the Germans. Instead of chicken pox, call it German pox, you know, whatever. But they changed it, I guess, to Liberty measles, which I guess makes you feel better. I had the German measles as a kid, y'all, and it was miserable. You can go blind. Now, hamburgers, which, you know, I guess is the name of an inhabitant of Hamburg. They're a hamburger, literally. There's a nice hamburger. Look at that. Look at the size of that hamburger. That hamburger's huge. Hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. So if you guys have to talk about kind of hysteria, you know, context of it, pretty silly stuff, right, to do that. Now, lest you think that we're immune to this, back when the French didn't support us in this air raid against Libya back in the day, y'all, there were Americans who got so mad at the French. How mad did they get? How mad did they get? Thank you, Oscar. That they renamed French fries Patriot fries. It didn't really. So I dare you at lunch today, like, hey, do you have any of those Patriot fries? Like, no, we got us French ones. So I don't want those. You know, but so it's not, you know, it's kind of crazy how weird people get. Now, beer. Now, when you think of beer besides Germany, well, no, besides Ireland, my great-great-grandparents' home, you think of Germany, right? Germany invented the style of beer known as lager beer. It's made in caves, or at least it used to be. That's what lager means. And it's one type of beer. The other type of beer is ale, right? Which is done differently. Well, most Americans, you know, Budweiser, Busch, all those companies, y'all, made German-style lager beer. That became unpatriotic. You're drinking German beer. You're keeping barley. You're keeping wheat. You're keeping all that stuff from our soldiers. And this is going to be the final nail in the coffin, y'all, for alcohol. And it's going to lead to the passing of the 18th Amendment, which is going to ban the manufacture, the transportation, or the sale of alcohol. And that didn't get changed until 1933. So from 1918 to 1933, it was banned. And in fact, some places like Maine was the first state to ban it. But nationally, even if your state didn't vote for it, y'all, once you got 3/4 of the states to agree to it, it became the law for all the other quarter states, whether they wanted it or not. And go ahead. Well, they did in little bits. Like, for example, we needed it for church services to make wine. A lot of people went to church. They also made it for some medicinal purposes, and they could make kind of like a very light beer. But people still made it at home. It's like, you know, it's against the law to have drugs, so we don't have drugs, right? Yeah, right? People are still going to do it. If there's a demand for it, and people are going to do it. And what it did, y'all, it caused organized crime to really flourish and become a national problem because people still wanted the alcohol. And so it happened. Do what, Oscar? Did a black market like a rise? Yeah, it created a black market for it, sadly, like there is for drugs, right? Now, some Germans, y'all, had to go so far as to change their name so they wouldn't get grief. So, like, let's say your name was Schmidt. You would legally change it to Smith. Maybe your name was Braun, B-R-A-U-N. It became Brown, right? Felt became Filled. All these different changes because your name just sounded that. If you think that's kind of crazy, the king and queen of England, y'all, their family was the House of Battenberg, which was a German house. So they changed their name during World War I to the House of Windsor. And that's where that comes from because it sounded too German. And some of the Battenbergs changed their name to like Mount Batten because Berg in German means mountain. And so it happened in England too, but especially among the royals. All right, now probably the lowest moment came with the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. If you know, we didn't really talk a whole lot about it, although I plan to on Thursday. Under President Adams, the first Adams, we had passed something called the Alien and Sedition Act. Now, most aliens, and by them I don't mean the guy that has, like, you know, the acid spit and everything and has the big head. I'm talking about immigrants, right? Y'all seen Alien, right? Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure. But anyway, aliens as in immigrants. under Adams, y'all, it became much, much harder to become an American citizen. Why did they do that? Because most immigrants were voting for his opponent, Jefferson, and his Democratic Republican Party. And so they wanted to keep them from getting the vote. And so they did that. Also, under the Sedition Act, it became illegal under Adams to criticize the government. Now, we had the Bill of Rights already, y'all, but the Supreme Court didn't yet have the power of judicial review to strike down laws that were unconstitutional. And that was considered sort of the low point. Now, as I'd said before too, y'all, during the war, during the Civil War, even Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus. Your right to be basically informed of the charge against you. And he had people jailed who had the wrong political beliefs. I hate to say that about my favorite president, but he really felt like he had to do this or he might lose Maryland to the Confederacy. So he arrested a bunch of pro-secessionist journalists and politicians. Okay, come to World War I. We're very, very worried. And we made it illegal for criticizing the government's war policy. Now, you could criticize the government. You could say nasty stuff about Wilson all you wanted. But what you couldn't do is criticize the fact that we were in the war and how we were fighting the war. And if you did anything that was considered rebellion, or sedition. Sedition is when you go against the government, you try to hurt the government in some way, you could go to jail. And the biggest way to do this, y'all, was to criticize or try to find some way to obstruct the draft. Now, this wasn't just one of those feel-good laws that sometimes are passed and not enforced. This was enforced on a few people. Eventually, 2,000 people were prosecuted, and half of them actually did jail time under this act. Now, like I said, there was a real threat of real espionage. Germans had agents here, either imported from Germany or Americans who were of German background who agreed to help their former country. So there was some of that. But once again, we always get, and a great word for you guys to know if you don't know it yet, one that people love to hear is overzealous. It looks like jealous, but it's with the Z. If you're overzealous, you go too far, right? You're a little too excited about it. And this statue, or this cartoon, I should say, really kind of reveals a lot of people's fear about this overzealousness of this bill, which became a law. Obviously, what's happening in this picture? Liberty's light is being taken. The Statue of Liberty, right? Her official name is Liberty Enlightening the World. They even have it down here in case like you don't know what Liberty is. The Statue of Liberty, there she is. She's even looking kind of downcast, kind of sad, right? Maybe she does that in real life. I don't know. But anyway, so what is stealing her lamp? The espionage bill. So basically, freedom, y'all, liberty is being taken away. And it says, must liberty's light go out? This was a real fear. And obviously, this person's point of view would be somebody very opposed to the Espionage Act, opposed to the abuse of civil liberties that happen so often. If you had this on a test, y'all, this would be a great way for y'all to get some historical situation by maybe mentioning other times that this has happened, or this is something, you know, that happens in wartime, and you could even connect it to Japanese Americans in World War II, maybe being, you know, interned for, you know, during the war. Now, once again, the last time we'll probably hear Eugene Debs. Seems like we've been talking about him for half the year. Remember, he had been the founder, the leader of America's Socialist Party. He had started out as just a labor leader, but when the Pullman strike was crushed by the military in Illinois, he went to jail. And in jail, he was radicalized like a lot of people are, like Fidel Castro. When he went to jail, y'all, he became a Marxist. You know, Hitler, when he went to jail, well, he became a Nazi in a lot of ways. Well, he was already a Nazi, but even more devout. Which is, as I told y'all, that's how Germans tie their shoes, right? They're little Nazis.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, what's their favorite number? 9. Anyway, sorry. I'll be here all week. Next week too, probably. Okay, so anyway, but Eugene Debs got thrown into jail, y'all, for 10 years. Now, ironically, a conservative Republican president, Warren G. Harding, let him out early as sort of basically he was old, and they thought he wasn't a threat anymore. But still, while he was in jail, y'all, in 1916, or was it 16? No, 1920, I guess he was still in jail. He ran for president. And that's kind of ironic because usually, y'all, our politicians are elected first, then they go to jail later. His idea was, hey, why don't I reverse that? I go to jail now, and then I get elected to an office. I'm already there, right? And I have a campaign button somewhere from the Eugene Debs Society, and it's got basically a picture of him in jail with the bars, and it says, vote for, and then it has his prison number on it. I love it. It's hilarious. But he does get let out. So he is probably the most famous victim of it. But the case you guys absolutely positively have to know for STAR test, and it wouldn't hurt you to know for AP test, is Skank or Shank. You hear different pronunciations, Schnick, whatever. Just know roughly how it's spelled versus the United States. Now, this all happened during the war, but it took a while for it to make its way to the USSC, that is, the United States Supreme Court case. Now, in this case, Schneck, who was basically accused, y'all, of distributing anti-draft pamphlets, telling people why they shouldn't support the draft, how they could avoid the draft, he was arrested and charged with sedition, right, for trying to, hurt the country's war effort. And like I said, he went to jail, he appealed, and eventually it reaches the Supreme Court. Now, this case is still relevant today. It is still in use today. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, right, normally a fairly liberal, enlightened kind of justice, he set what's become known as the clear and present danger test, or the clear and present danger doctrine. Now, what he basically said is, your right to free speech, your right to free press is not absolute. The government has the right to make some common sense limits on it. And the example he used was, freedom of speech does not allow you to yell fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire, right? Obviously, if there's a fire, y'all, in a theater, yell it, please. But if there isn't a fire, don't yell it, because what's going to happen? People are going to panic, right? People are going to get hurt. Yeah, it's going to be awful. It's going to be like a panic at the disco or something. But anyway, and so here's a Tom Clancy movie and book called Clear and Present Danger, where we invoked that, and we actually invaded Colombia trying to stop the drug trade. Didn't go very well. But anyway, this doctrine is still there today. So before a person's freedom of speech can be abridged, we have to consider what they're doing is very clear that it's a danger and that it's a present danger. It's like immediately a thing. And of course, one of the big arguments now is, does hate speech constitute a clear and present danger? Because there are people that say it can be banned. Other people say, no, it doesn't constitute that clear and present danger. And it's one of the things that y'all's generation is going to have to work out and kind of settle, okay? Some people say, like, hate speech, for example, right? Where you say nasty stuff that inflames people, gets people upset. But where do you draw the line? What if it merely hurts somebody's feelings? Should that be banned? There has to be, some setup to it. Otherwise, free speech is going to disappear.